Around the 1950s, America was a stable society where a lot of people just did what the norm was. This was known as the conformity of the 1950s. An example where society called out the conformity was in a color film called The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit. This film has several men all in identical suits sitting uniformly and doing the exact thing. Many radicals feared that no improvement would be made. JFK noted on this problem, saying, "Conformity is the jailer of freedom and the enemy of growth." They wanted to create a culture that surrounded an individualist lifestyle. It would later be called the counterculture. Starting in the 1950s by the notable Beat subcultures, they were a group of writers whose work focused on the rejection of social norms, materialism, and the use of drugs and sexual freedom. Members who followed the beat culture were called beatniks. Although hippies and beatniks were from the same origin, they still were very much different. The main difference was that hippies were more involved in politics while beatniks were not. The beatniks were a smaller group of authors. They shared the same rejection of conformity, but the beatniks did it in a more modest way. They wouldn't be in the marches like hippies. Instead, they would be in a state of solitude from the rest of society, usually wearing black clothes. On the other hand, hippies were an enthusiastic group of peoples. They wore bright colored clothes, and when they went against society, they usually did it in groups. They thought they could change the United States through their actions, while the beatniks thought they could do it through little things showing their presence. Around the 1960s is when counterculture really picked up. The personality of these people could be seen as loving, caring people. The counterculture's peak occurred during the growing U.S. involvement in Vietnam. It followed the path of the war as well, so when the war slowed down, the movement began to diminish. The counterculture was around before the Vietnam War, noticeably started by the Beat Generation. Mostly centered around San Francisco and New York, they focused on drugs and sexuality while rejecting the materialism of conformity of the rest of the United States. The hippies also partake in politics as well. Many times, hippies joined political radicals and people who tried to dodge the draft for the war to promote the back to back land living, free love, farming, and the use of weed. The hippies really stood out for what they believed in as well. They mostly believed in having no politics is better and that you should go out and live your life free. With more concern on the Vietnam War, the hippies would join the civil rights movement and oppose the Vietnam War. For the war itself, it was already a war where America lacked a lot of support. The media showed the real side of the war, and this upset a lot of people. They didn't like the war, but they would also not protest. This is what different about the hippies. They wouldn't be violent in protest. The anti war continued to grow throughout the United States, where people would focus on points like politics, race, and other cultural issues. Although people had different views in those sections, they all formed together because they opposed the war. The people who followed this movement were usually part of a new youth group of middle class white boys and girls. These people were usually college students or labor unions who wanted a new perspective and view on life. After the bombing of North Vietnam, the movement was a headline on everything. Everyone now wanted to join the movement. There were many marches because they seemed to be the most effective thing to do. A society called the Students for a Democratic Society really brought things to a national level when they called for a march in Washington against the bombings. The turnout was massive, and on April 17, 1965, 25,000 people gathered around the Capitol. These marches were meant to be very peaceful. The idea behind this was to make sure no extra violence occurred and the movement wouldn't get a bad image. By the 1970s, the moral of the war was very low. Although the war was seen as a bad thing, the movement became less united. This was due because a lot of people didn't like the cultural aspect of the counterculture people. Towards the end of the war, in 1973, the media started to lose interest in the following of the hippie movement.
The counterculture movement began to gain a large following when a group of people known as hippies started to take a stand against the man in the 60s. The word hippie was first used on a large-scale setting when a San Francisco writer used it in a paper on September 5, 1965, helping it gain the popularity that we see it as today. They were a much younger group of the earlier counterculture group called the Beatniks. Even though these two groups were both counterculture groups, They were quite different. One of the biggest differences in the two was that the hippies used the psychedelic drug called LSD. The hippies during the 60s tried to seek spiritual help from other drugs as well as marijuana, but it was mainly from a variety of psychedelic drugs. The reason that they mainly used psychedelic drugs was because they caused hallucinations, but that wasn't the only difference that the hippies had from the beatniks. They also had a major difference in the clothing that they wore. Hippies typically wore flamboyantly bright colors, where the beatniks preferred to wear a gray and red color scheme. Another thing that the hippies wore on a regular basis was they wore bell-bottom jeans or ripped jeans. To top everything off for the fit of the day, they often wore flowers in their hair. The difference between the two generations of counterculture doesn't end there. Another large difference is the type of the music that the two groups listened to. Folk and rock music were more of the hippies to listen to, and the beatniks listened to jazz music. With the hippies thriving all over the country, from the two hippie meccas, in a sense, of San Francisco and Haight-Ashbury, New York. The main question that comes to mind were who were the people joining into this type of lifestyle. The majority of these people were the younger middle-class white men and women who felt pressured to fit into the mainstream for the time, for the jobs, the living standards, and the looks. With hippies going upstream from the majority of the counterculture, it was hard for them to have a constant flow of income. So most of them moved out of the cities and into the country to a place where the cost of living was lower. This was not a large, wealthy bunch of people. The reason of why the hippies wanted to live this lifestyle through trying to find spiritual guidance from psychedelic drugs and living a more modest lifestyle wasn't because they could. The reason why they did this was because that they viewed society as the origin of all the social ills. One of the largest social ills of the time was the Vietnam War. However, the hippies fought against the social norm of going with whatever the government said by starting large riots and getting involved with the government. Woodstock began as a potential investment opportunity for four men named John Roberts, Joel Rosenman, Artie Cornfield, and Michael Lang. Lang had organized the successful Miami Music Festival in 1968, and Cornfield was the youngest vice president at Capitol Records. Roberts and Rosenman were New York entrepreneurs involved in building a Manhattan recording studio. The four men formed Woodstock Ventures Incorporated and decided to host a music festival. The initial plan for Woodstock called for the event to be held at Howard Mills Industrial Park in Walk Hill, New York. However, the town officials debated over the idea and decided to pass a law to make sure no concert would be held there. Woodstock Ventures explored a few other venues, but none would worked out. Finally, just a month ahead of the concert, a 49-year-old dairy farmer named Max Yasgar offered to rent them part of his land in the White Lake area of Bethel, New York. The partners jumped on the opportunity. The concert was originally only expected to bring in about 50,000 people, but days before the concert started, 50,000 were already camped out with 100,000 prepaid tickets coming. When the Woodstock investors saw that much more than 500,000 people were going to show up, they decided to make the concert entry free and focus on providing food and water. The people who attended Woodstock were mostly hippies and college kids. 32 singers and bands performed at Woodstock, the most notable being, for us, Jimi Hendrix and the Who Band.
Some critics argue the sexual revolution began May 9, 1960, when the U.S. Food and Drug Administration approved a reliable form of birth control called Enovid. This pill was the first oral contraceptive, and it was said to be 99.9% effective. The pill was so widespread and popular that by the 1970s, 12 million women were using it. This was known as the pill movement, and it was further escalated by the fact that the new generation believed sex had no consequences. These things led to a time also known as the sexual revolution. The sexual revolution was a movement opposed to conservative traditional codes, the codes that had to do with sexual relationships and behaviors that were previously followed by generations of Americans. Some of these codes were no premarital sex, no public nudity, only one partner, and no use of birth control of any kind. The new young generation, such as hippies and even college students, embraced the sexual revolution and began playing a role in it. The young generation wanted to revolt and be different, and they felt sex was the best way to do it. Because of this, unstructured relationships began to form, which is a relationship when people live together who are not yet married. These kind of relationships introduced the idea in the movement of the free sex movement. This was the idea that people could have sex with as many people and whoever they wanted to without having to deal with social taboos. Schools didn't do anything to help end this problem. During the 1960s, many people didn't think it was appropriate for schools to host sex education classes. Because sex was allowed to be so prevalent, a whole new industry was born that is still around today. Pornographic magazines became popular during this time period, and companies like Playboy became influential powerhouses. Although the sexual revolution was based primarily around the new young generation, breaking traditional codes based around sex, the pill movement also sparked the second wave of feminism. The pill movement gave women a sense of equality in a relationship. A major advocate for women's rights was Betty Friedan. She wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique. This book encouraged women to find their personal fulfillment outside of the traditional roles in the household. Betty Friedan is also one of the founding members of the National Organization for Women, or NOW, which was created in 1966, 3 years after her famous influential book came out. The major issues NOW wanted to address was the discrimination of women in the workplace, the lower rate of higher education for women, the lack of women in government and influential positions, and the expectations of women in domestic life. One other group of people who were inspired to take a stand during the sexual revolution was the LGBT community. People who considered themselves apart were backed up by the hippies, who also supported no segregation, the sexual revolution, and pretty much every aspect of the countercultural movement as a whole. This movement led to the first gay pride parade in 1969. Charles A. Reich was born May 20th, 1928. He was an American legal and social scholar, as well as a writer who was a professor at Yale Law School when he wrote the 1970 paean to the 1960s counterculture and youth movement. The book was called The Greening of America. The book had three main arguments, and they were arguments over worldviews. The first argument was Consciousness One, and it applied to the typical values and opinions of rural farmers and small business people which dominated society in 19th century America. The second argument was Consciousness Two. It represented a viewpoint of the organizational society and improvements through various large institutions, the ethos of the New Deal, World War II, and the 1950s silent generation. Consciousness 3 was the third argument, and it represented the worldwide view of the 1960s counterculture. The Conscious 3 also focuses on the growing number of young people rejecting their parents' way of life and laying a new foundation for how the post-war generation would live. Charles Reich had the view that the youth culture that was creating this countercultural movement would change the traditional forms of political organization and make it obsolete, and that this generation would change America forever. The counterculture movement of the 1960s played a key role in shaping modern-day society. It led to the growth in the music industry, which continues up to date. It resulted in the end of the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Act, Freedom of Information Act, restriction of FBI activities, the LGBT movement, increasing women's rights and powers, increasing awareness about the environment, and the fact that the youth and their opinions were taken more seriously. It also resulted in a less conservative and more liberal society. Although the movement was accredited to many positive things, it was also accredited to some negative things. The movement has been accused of leading to the degradation of American traditional values. The disregard for cultural values by the counterculture movement has also led to the unruly and violent society that we live in today. But the most important legacy of the counterculture of the 1960s is the ability to question authority. As shown by the hippie protests to the war and the racial discrimination and the secretive use of the FBI, the government was forced to make new laws and policies due to the questioning of their citizens. Today, questioning authority with almost no consequences is in every day of our lives.